Hi, my name is Rick Pyves, and I'm the author of Night Madness, a rear gunner's story of love, courage, and hope in World War II. Over the next little while, I'd like to share with you where the idea for Night Madness came from, as well as what I had hoped to achieve by writing Night Madness. Also, I'd like to introduce you to some of the main characters in the story, so let's get started. So, where did the idea for Night Madness come from? Sadly, it came about when my mom died in 2007, rather unexpectedly, and when we were cleaning out her apartment, my sisters and I found over 230 letters of correspondence between my mom and my dad, as well as my dad writing to his parents, mainly during the 44 to 1945. So it really was a new eyewitness to history in World War II from the perspective of the air war over Europe and the home front in Montreal. And so this really was the gist of the idea for Night Madness, was to take those letters and to weave together my father's experience into a true story of what happened from their perspective in World War II. I started writing Night Madness in January 2008, and it took almost 5 years of both research and writing before the project was completed. It was quite a task. It was finally published in the fall of 2012 in Canada and the USA by Red Deer Press, and it's a nonfiction account set in World War II. So, what is Night Madness all about? It's really the incredible story of Ron Pyves, a teenage tail gunner who fought over the war torn skies of Europe in the last 7 months of the bombing campaign, and he flew on 35 combat missions. Ron was able to beat the odds, making it through the war physically intact, only to face a new battle on the home front, fighting post traumatic stress disorder, brought about by his participation in the bombing of Dresden. The story also covers a long distance love affair captured in daily correspondence between two young teenagers, Ron and Kay, who were caught up in World War II. And it's really their perspective of the home front in Montreal and the bombing war over Europe during that time frame. So, what is the significance of the book title Night Madness? It really reflects on the fact that the majority of my father's combat missions were conducted in the nighttime. 25 of his 35 missions were at night. And over the target, if you look at the mix of deadly flak, brilliant lights from the probing searchlights, the multicolored target indicators, and the fire and bomb explosions on the ground, in combination with the raw fear of the young bomber crews, it really did create a chaotic, nightmarish environment to fly in. In addition, after the war, my father suffered from post traumatic stress disorder, which is a mental illness which was not well understood at the time. So, really, Night Madness is a confluence of all of these factors. What is it that I hope to achieve having written Night Madness? There's really three things that I would like to accomplish. The first is to help other individuals who may be in a similar situation to what my father experienced be able to recognize the symptoms of post traumatic stress disorder and ask for help. The second one really is to influence the government to be more diligent about the services and financial support that they provide our first responders, be they policemen, firemen, paramedics, or military personnel who suffer from the operational stress injuries such as PTSD. And finally, and probably most importantly, I like to provide recognition for all the individuals who served so courageously in Bomber Command, both on the ground and in the air during World War II. So just a few basic facts about World War II. The average age of a World War II veteran is currently 89 years old, so time is definitely marching on. There were almost 1.1 million Canadians who served in the military, including 249,000 in the Air Force, and this included both ground crew as well as air crew and support staff. In World War II, Canadian forces sustained 53,000 wounded and almost 45,000 killed in action, and this compared to in World War I, almost 67,000 killed in action and 172,000 wounded, primarily by artillery fire. From a global perspective, over 56 million war dead was the result of World War II, and unfortunately, this also included 35 million civilians. From a perspective of Bomber Command, over 20% of all dwellings in Germany were either completely destroyed or heavily damaged, displacing 7 million Germans, which definitely would have had a significant impact on the German economy. There were many sources of information which I used in writing Night Madness, including the personal letters which I just mentioned earlier, as well as the crew logbooks. Each crew member had their own logbook with their own personal observations. I also accessed the operational record books for both 431 and 434 Squadron, who both flew out of the Croft Air Base. Also, combat reports. Whenever one of the gunners was engaged in a battle with an attacking German fighter, they had to provide that information to the intelligence people on returning to base. And then also night raid reports, which covered off all of the night activity and raids by the RCAF as well as Bomber Command, which were quite interesting. Probably the most interesting of all was the personal interviews with the crew members. I did get an opportunity to actually interview 4 of the 7 crew members, and personal recollections of German civilians, particularly as it related to the bombing of Dresden, which I'll talk about in a few moments. In addition, there was a number of wonderful websites, including a Bomber Command website, as well as an RCF 434 Squadron website, which were quite helpful. Finally, 2 other sources of information which were very helpful was the military reports, which were accessible to the Directorate of History and Heritage, that were written about all of the Army campaigns during World War II from a Canadian perspective, as well as individual personnel military files. So let me introduce you to the crew members. There was normally 7 members on a Halifax or Lancaster bomber. The first crew member is Flight Sergeant Joe Cassavant, the flight engineer. He was 26 years old from Bonda, Saskatchewan, and he was a farmer in civilian life. Then there was Warrant Officer Second Class Bill Thompson, who was the mid-upper gunner. He was 21 years old from Toronto, Ontario. He tended to hang around a lot with my dad when my dad went on leave to visit his relatives in England. Then there was Flight Officer Hal Ward, the only married member of the crew. He was the wireless operator and backup air gunner. He was 23 years old from London, Ontario, and had about 800 hours of flying time the time he actually got to England and crewed up with the rest of the crew members. Probably one of the most important key figures in the crew is the pilot, who was Flight Lieutenant Bob Henry. He had extensive flying experience before he even came over to England to crew up with the rest of the crew members. He was 23 years old, and he was from Yorkton, Saskatchewan. We'll see later his brother also flew out of the same air base as a pilot. Then there was Flight Officer Frank Welsh, a bomb aimer, 21 years old from London, Ontario. Quite a character. Flight Officer Alan Coleman, who was a navigator, who was 20 years old from Magrath, Alberta. He also was a farmer in the prairies. And then, from my perspective, obviously, a very important crew member that was Ron Pyves. He was a tail gunner. He was the baby of the crew at 19 years old, and he was from Montreal, Quebec. The other key character in the story, obviously, is Kay Eason. She was 18 years old from Montreal, Quebec, when she met Ron up north skiing. This is the first picture which Kay sent Ron, which she received shortly after he arrived in England. In training, they had 4 near-death incidents in which Ron kept reminding the crew that this picture had become a good luck charm for the entire crew. It would eventually lead to them naming the plane after Kay. When I first wrote the story, my first draft, I didn't realize that Bob Henry, my dad's pilot, actually had a brother, Jack Henry, flying in 431 Squadron out of the same base as my dad's crew. Together, these 2 brothers flew on 72 combat missions, including 20 missions together. Both brothers won the Distinguished Flying Cross. Jack was an older brother, actually, to Bob. He was 26 years old, also from Yorkton, Saskatchewan. What I did was I went back and rewrote the story to include Jack because it added a lot of tension when you think about the fact of 2 brothers flying on the same missions and how scary that could be. Ron initially attempted to be a pilot, the large airplanes, the Lancasters and the Halifaxes, but unfortunately in training on the Tiger Moths, he wasn't successful. He had some depth perception problems. Then he moved on to the rear of the bus, and he ended up training as a tail gunner at number 9 Bombing and Gunnery School in Mont-Joli, Quebec. And you can see in this picture that Ron's actually in the front row on the right-hand side. When Ron finally moved from training to an actual combat squadron, him and his crewmates, they joined 434 Blue Nose Squadron that had been formed in June of 43 as part of Bomber Group 6. This particular squadron was almost wiped out 3 times. They lost 68 planes in that time frame over 43 through 45 versus a normal complement of 25 planes. When Ron actually joined 434 Squadron, it was known as the Chop Squadron with the highest losses in the RCF, which didn't bode well for Ron and the crew. In June of 1944 alone, the squadron had lost 8 aircraft. What's interesting is that 55% of all the losses were within the first 5 missions for 434 Squadron, and 76% of all their losses were within the first 10 missions. So if you made it through the first 10 missions, there was a good chance that you might make it to the end of your tour, although I did see several crews that were in the 30 to 35 range that didn't make it. In total, in 434 Squadron, 9 crews were actually lost on their first mission. There were 7 different bases in northern Yorkshire, and Ron's squadron flew out of Croft, which was the second most northerly air base, which might have accounted for some of the high losses, the fact that they were in the air longer and going to and from the targets. Even though the land was fairly flat around the air base, they did have to climb over some hills that were over 2,000 feet high, not that far from the air base. I'd now like to read you an excerpt from my book, Night Madness. I should probably acknowledge the fact that in this section, a lot of the information came from Frank Welsh, the bomb aimer, who I had interviewed quite extensively. And anyways, here it goes. On September 25th, there was a real chill in the air. Ron walked over to the briefing hut to find out about his second mission. The hut was particularly packed on this occasion, with over 240 crew members jammed in. All active bomber crews were briefed on the third of 4 daylight raids to be conducted on Calais. They were told by the briefing officer that the primary objective was to damage harbor fortifications. This included German troops that defended the port, who were being pressed by the Canadian infantry. This attack was coordinated so that as the last bombs fell, 2 Canadian infantry battalions, supported by armor, would immediately begin an assault on the German defensive positions located outside the city. Frank recalled later what transpired after the briefing. After a light breakfast, Ron and most of the crew headed over to the briefing hut that housed their flight gear. Bob and I had gone over earlier, and we were already fully dressed. While taking the time for a cigarette, we watched the antics of Ron and Bill, the gunners, as they struggled with their gear. As Ron and Bill would be exposed to the freezing air in their open gun turrets, they pulled on their bulky, electrically heated suits. If that wasn't enough, they also had to pull on an inflatable life jacket and parachute harness, making it almost impossible to move without an effort. Frank observed that Ron was slim and fair, and as the youngest member of the crew, quick in his reactions and speech, while Bill, with a dark complexion, would appear morose but for his flashing smile. Hal, the radio operator, was big blonde, and although one of the oldest crew members, quite jovial in contrast. Joe, the flight engineer, was squat and a former prairie farmer whose demands on life were uncomplicated. Al, the navigator, also from the prairies, had a steady wit and even disposition, which would prove to stand the crew in good stead in tight situations. Finally, Bob took one final puff and threw down his cigarette and stood up. That was the signal for the crew to get moving. Although to the crew Bob appeared small and almost delicately built, he was a quiet-spoken and intense individual, and an excellent pilot. He would prove to be always calm and unruffled, even in the direst of circumstances. The crew followed Bob out to the truck that would take them to the dispersal area. The planes were widely scattered around the airfield to minimize damage in the event of an air raid. We were accompanied by 3 other crews in the truck and a chaplain, who rode with the crews out to their planes. After leaving the truck at their dispersal point, the ground crew greeted Ron and the crew. They watched as Bob did his final walk around the plane, and I checked that the proper fuses had been attached to the bombs. After entering the plane from a door in the fuselage near the tail, each crew member went through their final checklists, including checking in with Bob over the intercom. As Bob started up each of the 4 engines, the racket from the engines became almost mind-numbing. It was a noise that we would have to endure for the entire trip. Just before taxiing, I noticed through the plexiglass nose a dimly lit figure darting under the fuselage, giving me the thumbs up as he pulled the wheel blocks away and the plane lurched forward. Bob could barely see the plane ahead of him, with one dim light on the tail as we both moved around on the perimeter track to line up for takeoff. Just after 9:40 a.m., Bob turned Halifax WALA for Able into the wind, and we were ready to roll. The green light was flashed and the control truck parked on his left on the grass. 2 minutes later, we were airborne in this different Halifax, which to the superstitious was not a good thing. Ron would fly on another mission to Calais on the next day on September 26th. What's interesting, and this is a photograph of the actual bombing from WLD. What you can see, which is quite interesting, is that at the bottom of each photograph that was taken by the airplanes, there's information on the elevation at which the bombs are dropped, the actual date of the bombing, the actual bomb load is actually indicated, as well as the pilot, and the aircraft and the squadron. There's actually over 40,000 of these photographs that are in the National Archives that were collected from all of the sorties that the RCAF flew in World War II. It was common for many of the planes in World War II to have nose art on the front of the airplane. In many cases, there were silly cartoon characters that brought a little bit of levity to what was otherwise a very dangerous mission. In this photograph here, we can see that the name on the airplane and the good-looking lady is called Kathleen. This airplane was actually named after my mother, given the fact that she brought all the crew good luck in their training before they actually went into combat. After from anywhere from 3 to 7 missions, most crews were given either 2, 4, or 7-day leave. When possible, a lot of the crews went to London. This is an actual membership card that my father had for the Beaver Club. It was a club, basically, or a social club in London that welcomed Canadian military personnel on leave, and they could actually have their mail forwarded to the club for pickup. On October 14th, 1944, the Allies planned a massive operation known as Operation Hurricane, which was scheduled for that day. It really was to demonstrate the might of the Allied air forces, and between two raids by the RCAF and RAF, there was also a raid by over 1,200 B-17 and B-25 bombers from the U.S. Air Force. This is a photo of my dad with the mid-upper gunner after they had completed 2 trips to Duisburg within 24 hours on October 14th and the night of the 15th. So really this was a tremendous effort by all the air crew and put a huge strain on the air crews having, in some instances, to fly 2 missions within 24 hours. Although they were not really supposed to take photographs of their aircraft, this is a shot of Bill Thompson standing on the top of WLD. He was the mid-upper gunner next to his gun turret. His gun turret was armed with 2 Browning 303 machine guns. Relative to the German fighters, which in many instances had 50 caliber guns, using a 303 machine gun to shoot down a German fighter was almost like using a pea shooter. This is a photo that's appeared in many books about Bomber Command in World War II. It actually was a public relations photo taken at a briefing before a raid on Essen on the night of October 31st, 1944. And although it was a PR photo, the reality was this was a real briefing. And just below the arrow, you can see my dad sitting there. He doesn't look too happy, which doesn't surprise me given they had had a number of canceled missions just before this particular mission. At this point, I'd like to do a second reading from my book entitled Fighter Attack. The target was Neuss, on the west bank of the Rhine River, 5 miles southwest of Dusseldorf. The objective was to disrupt German communications. Targeting German cities in a well-defended Ruhr Valley was definitely not a welcome assignment. In fact, Ron felt a gnawing ache in the pit of his stomach, knowing that the target would be well defended by massive concentrations of enemy searchlights and flak barrages and a protective umbrella of fighter aircraft. 2 weeks had passed since the crew last flew Halifax WLD. Once aboard, the crew immediately recognized the smell of oil that permeated every part, a familiar perfume unique to Kathleen. WLD had been armed with 10,000 pounds of high explosives. All the crew was nervous as they tried to get back into the combat routine, knowing once again that each trip might be their last. WLD left the runway just at sunset. 19 planes from 434 Squadron and 17 from 431 rose from Croft like birds of prey. They were joined by aircraft from 12 other Canadian bomber squadrons. After climbing to 18,000 feet, Bob joined the bomber stream and headed south. Once they reached the English coastline, Bob banked to port, heading across the channel into France. The sky was overcast over Neuss, with the clouds topping out at 6,000 feet. Visibility was poor. Bob approached the target at an elevation of 19,000 feet. Using sky markers as the aiming point, Frank dropped his load, plummeting to the hidden target below. Almost immediately, Frank could see fires and very large explosions through the clouds. The crew experienced moderate to heavy flak on their final approach to the target. Though they had completed 15 missions, they were still not comfortable with the black, menacing clouds of smoke reaching up towards them. Bob turned the plane on a course due south from Neuss. 10 minutes later, Bob set WLD on a course almost due west. Just seconds after Bob made this last turn, they were attacked from behind by an Me-109 fighter traveling almost 2.5 times faster than WLD. The enemy pilot was intent on knocking out Ron to make it more difficult for the bomber crew to defend itself from subsequent attack. The enemy fighter was first spotted by Ron 900 feet from his position on the same level as the bomber and closing fast. With no lights on, Ron found it difficult to pick out the fast approaching fighter against the dark sky. He quickly yelled to Bob, "Corkscrew to port," which he did immediately. It was only the intense and instinctive need to shoot down the attacker that prevented Ron from throwing up from nervousness. Bob's corkscrew involved a steep dive following a downward spiral to gain airspeed and made it more difficult for the Messerschmitt to hit the plane. He then reversed the dive into another corkscrew while climbing in altitude to keep the fighter pilot off balance. Everything happened in a flash, and for Ron it felt like a bad dream. With their adrenaline flowing, Ron and Bill's primary objective was to discourage the ME-109 pilot from pressing home his attack. If they got lucky, they might damage or destroy the attacking aircraft. Ron desperately tried to get the fighter in his gun sights. He fired off 2 short bursts. Suddenly, Ron's guns jammed, and while Bob continued diving, Ron managed to clear the stoppages despite the sweat pouring down from his forehead. Bob was able to shake loose from the pursuing ME-109, which did not get the chance to open fire. But the crew could not afford to relax in case another aircraft should suddenly burst out of the skies. Some German fighters teamed up in pairs, with one acting as a decoy while the other went in for the kill. After almost 3 unbearable hours, with the gunners straining every nerve and eye muscle, the crew finally arrived over Yorkshire. They touched down at 10:43 p.m. The next day, Ron decided to write Kay. "Dear Kay, I received your swell letter yesterday. I just got back from my leave a few days ago, and the first thing I did was to go to the mess and see if there was any mail from you, dear. When there isn't any, it makes me lose interest in everything. But darling, when there is a letter there for me from you, it makes all the difference in the world. We haven't been doing much flying for quite a while now, but I guess we'll be getting back into our old stride again now. I've got 16 ops done now. If my luck holds out for another 14, and I'm sure it will, I'll be finished. My luck's just got to hold out. Love, Ronnie." On March 22nd, 1945, what should have been Ron and his crewmates' last mission, their 35th mission, the bomber directly in front of their plane slid off the tarmac, resulting in a broken undercarriage and then broke into flames. The 7 airplanes that had not yet taken off all had to quickly scatter from the plane that was in fire, and the crew had to jump out and run prior to the plane had been damaged, blowing up. It had carried 14,000 pounds of explosives. As you can see here, it looks like almost an atomic bomb has gone off, and the plane in the foreground is my father's plane, WLD for dog. After waiting for another 48 hours, Ron and the crew were able to finally get off their last mission. It was to an oil refinery in Bottrop in Germany. After returning safely, he immediately sent Kay a telegram saying, "Have finished tour of ops. Love, Ronald Pyves." I'm sure you can imagine just how excited my mom was when that telegram arrived at her house telling her that Ron's tour was finally complete. There were a number of interesting incidents that the crew shared with me in Reading Night Madness, including St. Elmo's fire, which the crew experienced when you were caught in the middle of a big thunderstorm in training. Also, walking on air when my dad's leg actually went through the canvas on a Wellington bomber. Coned when the airplane was actually coned by enemy searchlights that were controlled by radar, as well as the fighter attack, which we mentioned earlier. Also, Bombs Not Away was when a bomb was actually hung up in the bottom of the airplane. And Beamsley Beacon was when one of the crew, after their tour was finished, their plane actually crashed, and 4 of the 8 crew members were killed. Fortunately, not my dad's crew member. And then also, Where's My Gear, where my dad came back from a mission, found that all his gear had been taken because everybody thought that he had been killed. Finally, the one I want to focus on now is actually the bombing of Dresden. As way of background, the bombing of Dresden will probably always remain a controversial topic. Dresden at the time was referred to as the Florence on the Elbe. They had a lot of beautiful architecture. Over a 26-hour period, Dresden was hit by 3 waves of bombers, 2 waves from the RAF and RCAF, as well as 1 wave from USA bombers. In total, they dropped over 7 million pounds of explosives and incendiary bombs on the city. And unfortunately, this resulted in a firestorm. This only happened twice in the war, once in Hamburg in July of 43, and the second one being in Dresden on February 13th of 45. There was 25,000 residents of the city were killed, and over 78,000 dwellings were completely destroyed. So definitely from a German perspective on the ground, it was a catastrophic event. As you can see from this photo taken just after the bombing, within about a week or two, you can see that a lot of the buildings were definitely totally destroyed. One of the questions that's still asked this day was the bombing addressed and necessary? It was the seventh largest city in Germany with many historic buildings and structures, but it also was a key manufacturing center with over 110 factories employing at least 50,000 individuals in various war industries, including aircraft components, poison gas, munitions, anti-aircraft and field guns, and precision optical goods. It was also a key communication and transportation center on the Eastern Front. The German army was in the process of planning to send many of their divisions from the Western to the Eastern Front to answer the Russian invasion, which had started in January of 45. Unfortunately, the city at the time was also flooded with a lot of refugees fleeing the advance of the Russian army. When my father returned back to Montreal, he married my mother in March of 1946. And for the first few decades, really, raising the family and going back to work as a technical draftsman, everything looked great. Unfortunately, the bombing of Dresden was always in the back of his mind, and he always felt guilty about what had happened back in February of 45. By 1968, it was evident that my father was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, even though at this point the actual term of PTSD had not been coined until the early 1980s by the American Psychiatric Association. And really, this came about because of all of the soldiers that were returning from Vietnam. Up to 30% of them were actually suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. In order to suffer from PTSD, an individual must either experience or witness an actual or potential life-threatening event, such as combat or car accident. The individual may unconsciously repress the memories of the dramatic event as well as try to avoid situations or stimuli which could lead to re-experiencing the original trauma. In the case of my dad, as I mentioned in Night Madness, basically he refused to take me and my sisters to fireworks displays because he says the fireworks reminded him of German flak as well as bombers falling from the sky. And he also couldn't watch war movies when he returned back home. The symptoms may occur shortly after the incident or many years later. For many veterans, it may actually be decades, 30, 40, 50 years after their actual exposure to the original life-threatening experience or incident. Individuals may become depressed and try to commit suicide or take drugs to self-medicate away their anxiety, and this would include also excessive drinking. One of the questions is asked is there a cure for PTSD? And the answer is definitely yes. The symptoms can be treated successfully. The key thing is that the sooner that someone's diagnosed, the better chance they have of actually being cured. Treatments include the use of support groups, medications, and cognitive behavioral therapy, which may include helping the patient in a controlled situation to relive parts of their traumatic experience. For active military personnel, one of the most important factors for recovery is the amount of positive support that the individual receives from his peer group. In closing, I'd just like to dedicate Night Madness to all those who courageously served in Bomber Command in World War II, both on the ground and in the air, and especially to the crew of WLD for Dog and 434 Squadron who brought each other home safely through 35 combat missions. I'll just close with one quote, a reaction of Patricia Burns, the author of They Were So Young, in terms of what she thought of Night Madness. She said, Night Madness captures the spirit of the times, the youthful bravado and honest fear of the aircrew as they fly on their combat missions to bring the war to Germany. Richard Pyves has also brought a love story to light in a beautiful tale of devotion, hope, and courage.